All right, shall we get started? All right. Thank you guys for coming out today, man. It's always great to see you guys. Today, we, as you I'm sure already know, are going to be focused on this question of what is mainstream jazz. So, have any of you guys heard that term before regarding the music? Okay, it's a style and a term that is not used nearly as much as it used to be, but it's still applicable. And the reason I kind of wanted to do something on this was because I think, in addition to sort of learning about what this style of jazz is, we'll also be able to see how the general, what I might call template is for presenting this music today, which is used, I would say, over 90% of the time you go to hear jazz. The template for presentation was developed as this style developed, if that makes sense. So, before we actually listen to some of this style of jazz, I think it's important to do a little comparative listening so we can sort of understand from a musical standpoint how this all developed. So let's start with this term, mainstream jazz. Where did it come from? Well, as best as I can tell, this gentleman, Stanley Dance, who's seen here on the left, there were almost no good pictures of him on the internet. This was the best one I could find. That's him on the left. The gentleman on the right you might recognize as the great Earl Father Hines. Stanley Dance was from the UK. He was English, and he was a wonderful writer about jazz. He was what some people might call a critic. And he also was an incredible advocate for the music. He was very, very close to Duke Ellington for almost Duke's entire career from the early mid-30s sort of forward till Duke died in 1974. He wrote a lot of wonderful books on the music. The World of Duke Ellington, The World of Earl Father Hines, The World of Swing. In addition to those and in some other books, he wrote a lot of great liner notes for the reissues of classic jazz records from the 30s and 40s, which started kind of in the late 50s through the 60s and 70s. A lot of times, if you buy the original LP reissues of those classic records, he will be the person that wrote the liner notes. He was incredibly knowledgeable about the music, obviously. And he's the one that basically coined the term mainstream jazz. And he did this in the earliest 1950s. So, where does this all come from, right? So if you think about the early 50s, this was right after World War II. And the early 50s was a very interesting time for jazz because during the 40s, all of these new sort of styles, or you might call them subgenres of the music, emerged, right? You had Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie with bebop. You had Lenny Tristano, Jerry Mulligan, and Gunther Schuller with the Cool School. You had Afro-Cuban jazz. You had, in the early 50s, the beginning of third stream jazz, which took jazz and European classical music. You had all these new sort of styles or subgenres of the music. What's up, Sujin? That's all right, come on in. So you had all these subgenres of music that had emerged by the early 50s. And with that, the way that the music was presented also changed. Now, why did that change? Well, in the 30s and 40s, this is the swing era. This is when large ensembles, big bands, kind of ruled the jazz world. There were small groups in the swing era, and of course bebop is generally a small group style of jazz, although you can certainly have bebop big bands like Dizzy's and Billy Eckstine's, but it's basically a small group music. But for that 20-year period, most jazz was presented in a big band setting or a larger ensemble setting. But by 1950, the economic situation of jazz had changed so much that it was almost impossible to maintain a big band because it just cost too much money, especially if you wanted to travel. It was hugely expensive to do that. So because of that and because of what World War II did to the music industry, Small groups were sort of the new order of the day. Now, some big bands reemerged in the 50s, like Count Basie's, Duke Ellington's, Woody Herman's, but for the most part, jazz was now, by and large, a small group music, meaning 6 or 7 musicians, anywhere from 2 to about 6 or 7 musicians. And because of this, and because of how the music had developed from the earliest days through the swing era, there emerged sort of this new generic template for playing the music. And that's largely what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get to that, I think it's good for us to do some comparative listening. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to 3 different recordings of this music. The first thing we're going to listen to is a very classic big band recording from the swing era, King Porter Stomp. This is Benny Goodman's orchestra, recorded in 1935. This record was one of the, if not the record that basically launched the big band or swing era. This was the first humongous big hit for Benny Goodman, and it really sort of, most historians will tell you that this record is the one that sort of launched all of that. And there's a backstory to that, which I won't get into today. But I want to play this because from roughly 1928, 1929 through about 1948 or 49, this is sort of how jazz music was presented. So we're going to take a listen to this. This is the great Fletcher Henderson arrangement of Jelly Roll Morton's King Porter Stomp. So let's check that out. Okay, so that's a great example of swing era jazz, large ensemble jazz. Now, if you noticed, we had improvisation, right? We had a clarinet solo, a trumpet solo, and a trombone solo. But the ensemble is playing even behind most of those solos, right? And plus, these records came out on 78 RPM discs, which only allowed for roughly 3.5 minutes of music per side, right? So you didn't get a whole lot of music with this stuff just because that medium was not able to do any more than that, right? So as we move to the next one, we're going to hear an example. Whoops, sorry. We're going to hear. This is a great example of swing era players, but playing in a small group setting. So this is not large ensemble music, right? These are all musicians from the great Count Basie Band. This is a great record that was sort of billed under this title, the Kansas City Seven, but these are all members of the Basie Band at that time. So we have the great Lester Young on tenor saxophone, Buck Clayton on trumpet, Dickie Wells on trombone, Count Basie on piano, Rodney Richardson, who was playing bass at the time, and the great Papa Joe Jones. And we're going to hear this tune, After Theater Jump. So what we're going to hear with this is it's going to be basically the same musical and rhythmic concept as Benny Goodman's big band or any other big band from the swing era. So, but the solos are going to be much more plentiful, and we're not going to have all of the orchestral component to it, right? We're not going to have arrangements that are written out that the musicians are reading. So when we heard King Porter stomp, everybody in the Benny Goodman Orchestra was reading that arrangement, all the different ensemble passages, the background figures behind the soloists. These guys are not reading music at all playing this. This is a tune that they knew. Dickie Wells was the composer. He probably taught it to them in the studio, and then they recorded it with no sheet music. So let's take a listen to this, and then we're going to listen to one more before we get to our focus. So this is the After Theater Jump. Okay. Yeah, man. Yeah. The Count's men, you know.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course. No, of course.
Was there anybody any more distinctive than Praise?
No, I mean,
what?
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is the great Joe Jones who plays on this, if you noticed, he changes how he plays behind Lester Young. He switches to playing an open ride cymbal instead of playing time on the hi-hat because he had such a great ear for Prez's style. He realized that if I do this, it works better behind him instead of playing time on the hi-hat. If these guys had not existed, jazz would have sounded very different. I mean, they're incredibly important musicians to American music. Okay, so we've heard this swing era style in both a large ensemble and now a small group ensemble. So now we're going to switch ahead and we're going to hear a record from just over a year later. So this is when things start to change. Now what I want you to listen to is, we've heard a bunch of different swing era soloists so far. I want you to listen to how the rhythmic line, the rhythmic concept changes with this group of musicians. So we're going to hear the classic Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker composition, Sha 'Nuff. This is from May of 1945. So we'll check this out and then we will move ahead. So, what was different about the improvising? Well, everything. What did you hear that was different from After Theater Jump? Anybody? The tempo is definitely faster. Absolutely. Totally. The biggest thing is the rhythmic concept is different. They're using rhythm that's a lot more complex. It's not better than how swing era players played, it's just different, right? But there's an important similarity between Sha Nuff and After Theater Jump, which is going to lead us into this whole idea of mainstream jazz. So in big band music, arrangements were and can be written in many different ways. But in this small group setting, this template starts to emerge that becomes the dominant way that this music is presented. So, this idea of the theme or melody, variation, improvisation, extended solos, and then the group coming together again to restate the melody. If you go out to hear jazz music, which everybody in here does, some people play it in this room, over 90% of the time, this is the template that is used, right? And what's really cool is, now that it's 2025 and we have all this elapsed time with this music, so you had small group swing musicians that use this template. Bebop musicians use this template. Cool jazz musicians use this template. Third stream jazz musicians use this template. Even a lot of avant-garde jazz musicians use this template. Ornette Coleman's group in 1959, theme, solos or variation, theme, right? Jerry Mulligan's cool jazz group in the early 50s that also had no chordal instrument, theme, variation, theme, right? There are certain situations where you don't use this, right? But most of the time, this is the generic template that all of us use now. And this is what Stanley Dance, or as Duke Ellington called him, Stanley Dance, he's the one that coined this because he saw that all of the sudden this music, they were utilizing this general way to play it. Now, what's really cool about this template is that because of what I just said, all of those different styles, all those different groups that use it, it makes room for most kinds of players, which is really cool. And this is what makes mainstream jazz interesting, is because by the mid 50s, there was this focus on small groups, and they all of the sudden, the focus was much more on the soloist and not the actual ensemble. If we go back and listen to King Porter Stomp, a lot of that, even though we get three good solos in that, most of it is this entire group of 15 or 16 musicians playing this interesting arrangement, right? Which is great. It's now turned almost 180 degrees the other way. Because like After Theater Jump, we heard that melody once, it was just a riff melody, but then we got all this improvisation, and then we got just the last A section of the melody one last time. Most of it, 90% of that recording was improvisation, whereas King Porter Stomp, only probably about a third of that recording was improvisation. The other 2/3 was ensemble stuff, the arrangement, what Fletcher Henderson had written down. So it's actually, and if you go back to the very beginning of the music, there was no such thing as a true soloist. For the first 20, almost 25 years of jazz, all improvisation was collective. So if we think of an early jazz, or what I call a traditional New Orleans frontline ensemble, trumpet, clarinet, trombone with a 4-piece rhythm section, piano, usually a tuba or brass bass, banjo, and drums. All of that improvisation in those groups was collective. The 3 horns were improvising together, which is a beautiful way to improvise. It's just a different way. This isn't better, it's just different, right? George.
Forgive me if you already said this too, but it seemed like in the swing era, opposed to what we just listened to with Dizzy and Charlie Parker, the whole form is being improvised over, whereas in the swing era, it might just be trumpet for the bridge.
Thank you.
Trumpet for the last A section. It's a smaller.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you're not 100% sure what George is talking about, a lot of times in the swing era, those arrangements, the improvising, the soloist might get a full chorus of the song, which could be usually like a 32-bar AABA form. The soloist might get a whole chorus, but more often than not, they got 8 bars or maybe 16 bars. So they didn't have a lot of time to improvise. This new template allows for extended solos, right? When we listen to After Theater Jump, Lester Young took 2 full choruses. The others took 1, right? So that's a huge change in the improvisatory part of jazz. It went from rather limited solo space for a soloist to all of a sudden it's like, play as long as you want, you know? Now, jazz musicians, I was not around in the late 1920s or early 30s, but at after-hours jam sessions, a lot of times musicians would take extended solos, but that was really only confined to that sort of setting, you know? Largely due to the fact that the 78 RPM disc could only hold about 3.5 minutes per side. But also, in the 30s, this is when radio was huge. So if you were a big band leader, you wanted to get a gig where you could get on the radio to do a live radio broadcast. But they were usually short, so you couldn't have super extended solos even on the radio, right? So this idea of the music going from 2/3 to 3/4 ensemble material or music, that totally flips, and now most of it is improvising, right? That's a big shift if you think about how the music is presented, and now this is basically how most of us play most of the time, okay? So, oh yeah, Alex.
Question about like solo length.
Yep.
You were talking about music from the swing era.
Yep.
When after-hour sessions are long, you know, they often had time to stretch out. Did people stretch out often when they were playing for dances? Or did you find that also shorter just to keep the dancers from?
Yeah. I do think there had to be instances where, you know, especially at venues where there were really great dancers, you know, I'm sure that there were instances where, you know, bands would extend tunes and blow. I mean, but in general, yeah, you know, you want to keep the tunes pretty contained for dancers, just because the average person, especially if it's a faster, you know, they can only dance that way for a few minutes and then they need a break, you know. So, but yeah, I think that there had to be instances where there were, but by and large, the improvising was a lot shorter back then, yeah. Any other questions or comments before we kind of get into George?
Say, man, we should bring that back because aside from Scott, man, there's not too many people on here.
Yeah, but don't think about
I agree.
you messing with Scott. That's a good dude, man.
He is a good dude, man. No, but
You know, in black communities, it was different. You know, to your point, you know, black people are so rhythmic, and we loud. We talk shit all day. Seriously, come on, let's just be real about it. You know, y'all here because y'all brothers and sisters because y'all hear the music, we understand it too. So I'm just talking to my folks. Right? But the reality of it is, if you're at a black club and they're playing jazz, and the soloist gets hot, black people are gonna buy shit crazy.
oh yeah.
You know, and they sitting up there spurring you on.
Oh yeah.
You know, and then it gets longer. But to his point, you know,
Yeah.
y'all learned a lot from this. It's excellent discussion. And Georgia also.
No, but you're making a great point.
But you know what? You know, the cultures, you have to understand where this music comes from. And at that point, the poignancy of where it came from was real. Now, it's some expansion. This is the real stuff here.
Yeah.
You know, what was happening in communities. Because I know when you used to come up on the Hill District, when I was a little kid, it was just mesmerizing people.
Yeah.
Because it was just sights and sounds, you just hear this shit on the street.
Yeah.
You know, it ain't like when you walk through here right now, y'all ain't even seen it here for real.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was it. I mean, you heard it coming out. I mean, seriously, you walk down the street and heard thing on the jukebox, saying Thursday on the jukebox.
Yeah.
I was no boy, you know.
Yeah. But that's
But it's real.
that's a great point. I mean, there are radio broadcasts like Count Basie at the Famous Door from like the summer of 1938. I mean, you listen to that and I mean, I talk to my friends about that. Like, I can't imagine being in that room and like, because you can hear like that energy and that it's incredible. So that's a very important point.
Especially up here, you know, one thing.
Go right ahead, man. Go right ahead.
Up here on the hill, across the grill, you know, you start getting hot. And you are the people. I mean, for real though. They know little George Benson. They know little you know, he wasn't Bohemian. You know, they knew all the cats. They knew Kenny because he's homeless dude, like what they worried about.
Yeah.
And it's a whole different sensibility when you go back home. Because I remember George in the early time, when he first started getting really hot, he got commercial. Right at that point, at the initial point, he would leave the gig downtown and come up to the grill and play for the rest of the night free.
Yeah.
Or walk off the stage, sit with his friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and that's how it went. It was a different cultural thing. So in the context of that cultural socialism, it was just different. You know, and but the guys like you, the thing about it is seeing you up here now, I'm pissed off the black folks that don't come here, and now the white guys come here and everything else. I should be scared to go to our joints. And it take, you know, and now you're here doing this, you got it consistent. It's just cool that way. I just wish it was a better merge.
I hear you, man. I hear you. Yeah, I mean, the music, when it was in the black community, I mean, I got the very end of that in the 90s when I started coming around, and it's a whole other thing. I mean, even from the little bit that I experienced. So that's a great point as far as, you know, how the aesthetic of it all was. So this kind of brings us to this idea of mainstream jazz. And by the mid-50s, what we start to see are these different recordings, concerts, what we're going to see in a minute on television. Jazz used to be on television a lot, especially in the 50s and 60s, which it's very sad that it's not that way anymore. But it did used to be on TV quite a bit. And so what we're going to do is we're going to watch a few different parts. In 1957, CBS produced an hour-long television show on jazz. It was just called The Sound of Jazz. And it featured a whole bunch of different musicians. And we're going to sort of be able to see this idea of mainstream jazz kind of in action. So forgive me while I kind of skip around a little bit with this, but we're going to watch it from the beginning here. This featured members of the Count Basie Orchestra along with a whole bunch of different great soloists, which I will point out to you as we go. So we have this full big band, a lot of members of the Basie band with others. The great Coleman Hawkins is one of the great guests. And then they have all these different small groups that play. Jerry Mulligan, who at this time was really just one of the figureheads of the cool school of jazz. So already we have this incredible stylistic mix. That's the great Joe Newman, who was in the Basie band at the time. Papa Joe Jones, of course. That's the great Eddie Jones, who was in the Basie band at the time. Freddie Green, of course, on guitar. That's Jimmy Rushing, the great vocalist with the Basie Band. That's the great drummer O.C. Johnson, who also plays on the program. So you see, there's a huge mix of players. So forgive me as we skip ahead just a little bit. So what we're going to see next, let me just explain this real quick before they start playing. So what we're going to see now is a small group, and they're going to be playing in more of a trad jazz or traditional jazz style. But what you're going to see is them taking that early style and sort of putting it into this new template that we just talked about. So instead of there being just collective improvisation, we're going to hear both collective improvisation and individual solos. This is going to feature the great trumpeter Henry Red Allen, who's one of the great early trumpeters in the music.
Very short, 12 bars. According to how a guy feels, maybe they might have a happy feeling and still can play great blues. Might be very sad and still do, but instead of the atmosphere of the other guys. It's exciting, and it reaches the next person. Probably they may have troubles, and I think it helps to make them happy. I'll forget their troubles. Same as they do the playing of the place. Seems like it.
Coleman Hawkins is in this group.
In fact, that's what
Joe
I
Jones.
seem to pick up from people that's listening.
That's Pee Wee Russell, who was a great early jazz clarinetist. It's the great Milt Hinton on bass. Now individual solos. Now, had they been playing this in a true trad jazz style, there just would have been more collective improvisation between the horns and the front line. But we have individual solos. This is fitting into that mainstream template. That's the great trombonist Vic Dickinson. The use of those little breaks is very indicative of that earlier style. The great Pee Wee Russell. Very unique clarinetist. So I'll tell you what, that's the great Charlie Shavers. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Rex Stewart, not Charlie Shavers. So the other thing to mention about this mainstream style is that while it's fitting into this template that we talked about, the other thing that's important to note is the way the rhythm section is playing behind these guys. Because while this is Wild Man Blues, it's this trad jazz, this earlier song and earlier song form. The rhythm section is sort of playing in more of a swing era style, right? Joe Jones is keeping time on the hi-hat and then the ride cymbal instead of just the snare drum and the bass drum, which if they were playing in a true early New Orleans style, he would have played the time and the groove all on the snare drum and the bass drum. So the sort of the final thing to understand about what makes mainstream jazz is the fact that the rhythm sections are playing in basically a swing era type style. They're not playing in an early New Orleans trad style, and they're not really playing like Max Roach and Kenny Clark and Bud Powell, like the beboppers. They're not. Joe Jones is not playing the kind of polyrhythmic syncopations that people like Max Roach and Kenny Clark were playing. It's a little bit more of a smoother sort of all-encompassing sort of rhythm section style. Does that make sense? I hope that makes some sense. The more you listen, the more you'll hear that. If I had my drums here, I could kind of demonstrate that for you. But I think you kind of understand. Now, again, the thing that makes this mainstream template so great is that it can accommodate all these different players, right? So you can have more trad players like the great Henry Red Allen or Pee Wee Russell, but you can also have swing era players like Coleman Hawkins. You can have more modern players like Charlie Shavers, who's also part of this, and a host of others, Jerry Mulligan. They can also fit into this template and they can make music together. Whereas I think a lot of times people who are just getting into jazz, maybe they think like, okay, well, if you play like this, you can really only play with those kinds of players. And that's really not the case. And it was this sort of the development of this sort of generic template that made it possible for a lot of different stylized players to work together. And there are a lot of different records that will demonstrate this. If you're interested in that, I'd be happy to give you some titles to kind of, get you started. The thing about mainstream jazz for me that is, I think, important is this is a great way to sort of introduce people to this music if they have never really heard it before. Because if you introduce them via this sort of mainstream concept, you can get a really pretty good idea of what most of this style of music is about by listening to this particular sort of subgenre of the music. You know what I mean? But because of its development, we get in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, really, we get a lot of great recordings that feature artists that are very, very different playing together. And it was because this was sort of developed that allowed that to happen musically. Does that make sense? The historical importance of it? Plus, a lot of times, the other reason that I kind of wanted to do something on this topic was, as somebody that's been trying to play this music for a while, a lot of the questions that I get asked is like, well, how do you know when to play a solo? How do you know when to, people aren't, if you're new to the music, it can be confusing when you see a performance like this. Well, it's really cool, but like, how did they know when to do all of that? Well, it was this template that allows for it. The theme or the melody, you have all sorts of improvisation, and then the musicians return as a group to restate the melody or the theme again. And so most of the time, again, the music is presented like this. So we have kind of like that's how musicians are able to just come together and play spontaneously, which I've found, and I'm sure all the musicians in here, like, people are amazed at that. It's like, how did you do that and you never met that person before? Because we all speak this common language and we're using this common format. Okay? All right. Any questions or comments? We've got a couple more things to check out. Anybody got anything to say? Nothing? George.
I find it amazing when we watch these old clips, just how modern this antiquated clip is.
Yeah.
It's like everything I'm hearing from Joe Jones is like 2025. And people should be honored if that was 2025. Like, man, what a great leap we've taken. It's amazing. Just nothing about this is antiquated.
I know.
It's so modern and cutting edge, and it still sounds that way. I mean, if the recording quality were 2025, you'd be like, man, who is this?
I know, that's great. Who are these guys, right? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of incredible how the language of jazz by this point was really pretty much all developed. There were other things that happened after this that were really important and great, but if somebody came to a jam session and played the solo that Vic Dickinson played on that, people would be like, man, who's that trombone player? Where did he come from? People wouldn't be like, oh my God, will you listen to this guy playing that old, man, that's just so boring. It's like, no, it sounds great, So you're totally right about that. And, it's funny, our culture has developed into this thing where it's like, if it's not brand new, then it's not cool or it's not worth checking out, and it's sad because of that exact thing. Like, if you listen to this and it's like, man, that's really great music, man.
It's also beautiful to see not an iReal app, not a single one.
Yeah. No one's got their phone set up so they can get some good content for their page, Yeah. I hear you. So we got two more things to check out, and then I promise I'll let you go on your way. But I thought that since we're talking about mainstream jazz, we've seen a bit of this. But I thought we would listen to a track from a record that is called Mainstream. This is an all-star record date, and if you look at this list of musicians and you're into this music, there's a few names that you're going to go, ooh, wow, that's very interesting, right? So we have some very well-known musicians in this group and some musicians who are not very well-known. So on trumpet is a gentleman who you might not be familiar with. He was a great swing-era trumpeter, Joe Thomas. Another even lesser-known trumpeter from that era, Johnny Letman. The great Dickie Wells is back on trombone from the Basie Band. Buddy Tate, who's a great swing era tenor player, he's the one who took Lester Young's place in Count Basie's band when Lester Young left. Incredible swing era tenor saxophonist. On clarinet is a musician that goes all the way back to the 1920s, the great Buster Bailey. He was part of a lot of different groups in the swing era. He was part of John Kirby's great small group. On piano is probably the most interesting, and that's the great Herbie Nichols. Herbie Nichols is a very sort of obscure figure, but he made some very interesting records for the Blue Note label in the 1950s. He died, unfortunately, very young. His original composing and his piano playing are very, very interesting. On this recording, he just sounds like a great swing era pianist. He doesn't sound like the Herbie Nichols from those Blue Note records. Everett Barksdale is on guitar. He was a great, and I spelled his first name wrong, I apologize. He was a great swing era rhythm guitar player. Bill Pemberton was another swing era bassist who is not very well known. Jimmy Crawford is the drummer, and he was a great swing era drummer. He was part of the great Jimmy Lunsford Orchestra in the mid-late 30s. Wonderful swing era drummer. So we're going to hear their recording of the standard Crazy Rhythm. So we'll check this out. And again, this template of melody, solos, and then we return to the melody. Yeah. So there you go. All right. You know, it's amazing to me when you listen to records like this in this style with all these different soloists. It's amazing how their personalities are so distinct when they play. Even though they're using a lot of the same rhythmic language, especially in this case, their personalities are so distinct on each instrument. The way they use rhythm and the way they use their sound. It's really something, man. I've been listening to this stuff for a while now, and it never ceases to amaze me, like the incredible individuality, which is kind of missing today in the music. There's some great musicians today, and some who are very, very interesting and unique, but it seems like back then it was different, you know, in that regard. So, very interesting. Any questions or comments? No? Okay, so our time today is going to sort of dovetail us into next month's session, because next month we're going to be talking about Norman Granz and jazz at the Philharmonic, which relates directly to this idea of mainstream jazz, because in the 50s, when jazz at the Philharmonic really took off, it started in the 40s, it really they used this template and this style to present that music. Jazz at the Philharmonic, I won't talk about it too much because that's for next month, but it was basically a traveling jam session, basically, with some of the most important players being featured. And there's a lot more to the story, which we'll get to next month, but I wanted to end today by playing the beginning of a short, well, it's actually a long video, but we're just going to see a short part of the beginning. This is a Jazz at the Philharmonic concert from 1967. And the group is really, really interesting. I mean, you want to talk about musical personalities coming together. This is going to feature a very, very diverse group of musicians, both stylistically and across generations. But this is going to sort of give us a little preview into what we're going to be talking about next month. Norman Granz is one of the more important figures in this music as a non-musician. I'll obviously talk more thoroughly about him next month, but he started this whole idea of jazz at the Philharmonic. He was a huge jazz fan, obviously. He was a businessman, and he did well in his business. He made some good money, and so he loved the idea of jazz musicians in a jam session setting, and he had the idea to present that on a concert stage, which hadn't really been done before. It kind of had, but not really. He wanted to make this sort of a way to listen to the music. So in the 40s, when he started jazz at the Philharmonic in about 1944. And at that time, you know, bebop was just sort of beginning. It was still the swing era. And so people who were really into jazz always wanted to sort of attend like an after hours jam session where it was just musicians playing for their own enjoyment. And he loved doing that. And he thought, like, man, people should be able to see this, not just, you know, the musicians. It's great. Like, you get to hear these guys play all these extended solos and it gets really exciting. So that was sort of the catalyst for him starting jazz at the Philharmonic. But we're going to see the beginning of this concert from 1967, and Norman Granz is going to introduce all the musicians. So we'll sort of end with this. This is from over in Europe on the BBC. They really like it over there.
Thank you.
This is Norman Granz.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I'm happy to present Jazz at the Philharmonic. And unlike the other jazz concerts, which have the fixed groups like Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald and her group, the Oscar Peterson Trio, this is the jam session. And for me, this is the first love in jazz, because I like to hear musicians improvise and do different things each night. So if we're lucky tonight, we'll hear a very, very good concert. And if we're not, it'll just be a good concert. In any case, I'd like to introduce the members of the first jam session to you, beginning with the rhythm section. The drummer is Louis Bellson. Good. I made it a practice with Jazz at the Philharmonic to bring over the best names I could find, the best names being synonymous, in most cases, with the best musicianship. But I also like to introduce new people, people who are going to be great in the future. I'm very happy to present one of the future greats on bass, Bob Cranshaw. And to complete the rhythm section, this man is already great, Teddy Wilson. On the horns, if you've ever seen the Jerry Mulligan Big Band, or if you have the records of the Woody Herman Herds, you'll recognize our tenor saxophonist, Zoot Sims. And his colleague on saxophone, and also occasionally on the flute, James Moody. In the brass section, one of the alumnus from Count Basie's orchestra and Duke Ellington, and a very fine recording artist in his own right. On the flugelhorn, Clark Terry. Well, you all know Dizzy.
So we have our melody, or our theme. And now solos. So this is a wonderful example of sort of this whole idea of how to play and present this music. Starting from the mid 40s, we ended up in the later 60s, where this is now sort of like a crystallized and very, very common way to play this music. And as you can see from this brings together, I mean, Teddy Wilson and James Moody. That's amazing. Bob Cranshaw and Louis Bellson. I mean, multiple generations, all these different players. They're all speaking the same language, but they have very different paths, through the music. But this template lets them present the music at an incredibly high level. So that's all I got for you today. Any questions or comments on any of this? Nobody ever wants to say anything, man.
Thank you for putting all this stuff together.
Oh, man, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So just a couple of quick programming notes. On the 25th of this month, which is the fourth Saturday, we'll be back in the basement, and the great Paul Thompson is going to be leading his Wayne Shorter inspired group. That'll be from 1 to 3, and then we'll be back here on the second Saturday next month. I can't remember what the date is. I think it's the 8th. I think whatever the second Saturday is, we'll be back, and we'll be talking in depth about Norman Granz and Jazz at the Philharmonic, because there's a lot more to talk about than just this nice guy who presented great jazz concerts. There's a lot more to the story and a lot more great music to check out. So if you're free and interested, second Saturday next month. So thank you guys so much for doing it, man. Yeah. There's no one in the world that can play trumpet like Clark Terry.